for the month of Shvat, to thank the Elbaum Mishpacha for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Drashos this month in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Yaakov couple, Ben Avram Menachem, loving father and husband. Jerry Elbaum, Zichron Levrach, we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah and the family a Nechama. We thank Mrs. Bracha Strimber, our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Shvat, for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Drashas this month in memory of her beloved husband, Avi, Avram ben Kalman Eliezer Halevi. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah and the family a Nechama. We thank our Week of Learning sponsor, the Getz family, in memory of Moshe Chaim's father and mother, Alter Hirsch ben Binyamin, and Chana Chaya Bas Moshe Zichronim Livracha. And we thank our Daf Yomi sponsor, Ephron, for dedicating the Daf this morning for the 8th yahrzeit of Beatrice Ephron Brana Bas Alter Yerachmiel, and Rina Dubin. The shir this morning in memory of Baruch Meir Dubin's grandfather, Moshe Mendel ben Zev Zichron Livracha, on the occasion of his 31st yahrzeit. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah and the families a Nechama. Shkoch to all of the Mishpachos for their sponsorships. So we'll say with that, let us begin. So a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. Today's daf is daf Samech 60. And we are picking up on Nun Tes 59b. So we'll say we are picking up at Rami Le Rav Safra L'Rav, which is about 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, about 20, 21, 22 lines up from the bottom. It's right after there's a period over there. So Rami Le Rav Safra L'Rav. So we'll say Rav Safra posed a question to Rav. What was the question? Ksiv lo yolin laboker zevach chag Pesach. So the pasuk will say this. Now remember, this is similar to the pasuk that and I apologize because I know that I blew through this, the last couple of lines of yesterday's daf. So if you remember again, so Rav Kahana brought up the psukim of Lo Yolin Chelev Chagi Ad Boker. So I think I might have mentioned that pasuk refers to Pesach, which I don't remember what I have to listen back to the shir, which is not correct. That pasuk is just talking about Stam Karbanos. So now the Gemara is bringing up a pasuk by Pesach, and the Gemara says as follows. It says Lo Yolin Laboker Zevach Chag Pesach, right? Zevach Chag Pesach. You cannot leave until the morning. Can't leave over until the morning. The offering of the Chag Pesach. Now I will say, to be clear, this is actually not referring to the Karban Pesach, but Bepasha is referring to the Chagiga. So on one hand it says, Labokehu de lo Yalin, you can't leave it over until the morning, Ha-kol halayla Yalin, but you can leave it over the entire night. So it sounds like as long as it is done by the morning, that's fine, but you can leave it out the entire night. I v'haksiv Olas Shabbos b'Shabboso, v'lo Olas Chol b'Shabbos, v'lo Olas Chol b'Yom Tov. But one second, the Torah says Olas Shabbos b'Shabboso, which Shabbos we learned means what? That halacha l'maisa, you could burn the Olah of Shabbos on Shabbos, but you can't go ahead and burn the Olah of Shabbos during the week, or the Olah during the week on Shabbos, or the Olah during the week on Yom Tov. In other words, Shabbos say that when you offer up a particular carbon on a particular day, it's only the carbon of that day which could be consumed on the Mizbeach that day. But if, let's say again, a carbon was offered up during the weekday, you can't burn it on Shabbos, so you can't burn it on Yom Tov. But I will say, remember, anything that is being consumed on Pesach, or anything being consumed on the first night of Pesach, was slaughtered by day. This is already brought up and it was answered. The Gemara says, what's the case to which the pasuk is referring? It's referring to Erev Pesach, which fell out on Shabbos. Ultimately, again, therefore, anything offered up on that Shabbos can in fact be burned on the Mizbeach over the course of the night. Why? The Chelvei Shabbos craven b'Yom, because any leftover fats or limbs or carbonic matter that were slaughtered on Shabbos could be burnt on the Mizbeach on Yom Tov. So the Gemara says, Anon neku v'neima le dahai kraba arba asar shechalios b'Shabbosu dichsiv le. Are we going to say that this entire pasuk in the Torah is only referring to a very specific circumstance of Erev Pesach falling on Shabbos? To which the Gemara says, Shavki lekra tehudachik or mokim anafshe. Yes, leave the pasuk as it is, that the pasuk is dafka referring to a case where Erev Pesach fell out on Shabbos. Ultimately, since the pasuk itself is difficult to interpret, it lends itself only to this very narrow interpretation. Good. So we'll say ultimately, again, that ends this particular sugya. Now, the truth is, there is a lot of halacha that comes out of the sugya that we just did. I don't know that we have time to go ahead and go through all of it. The only thing I will tell you is as follows, that the Rambam in Hilchos Karban Pesach, Perek Aleph Halacha Dalet, because remember again, we were talking a lot about the timeline. So remember again, the way we're introduced to this Perek is what's the timeline for the Tamid. In yesterday's daf, the timeline grew a little bit, right? So remember again, what we were introduced to in the beginning of the Perek is the Tamid Shal Shachar is the first Perek, is the first offering. Tamid Shal Ben Arbaim is the last offering, and all other karbanos occur within that window. In yesterday's daf, we saw actually that's not, and I'm sorry, and with one exception, Karban Pesach. The Karban Pesach is offered up after the Karban Tamid. Okay? Yesterday's daf, we kind of expanded on that a little bit. And we saw, well, first of all, there is something offered up before the Tamid Shel Shachar. And what is that? That's the morning Kitoras. The morning Kitoras, in fact, is offered up before the Tamid Shel Shachar. What we were also introduced to, by the way, is not necessarily sacrificial items, but additional temple services of the Kitoras and the Menorah. So if you remember, we saw two conflicting brises as to when Pesach occurs in relationship to Kitoras and Menorah. In brisa number 1, it was Tamid Pesach Kitoras Menorah. In brisa number 2, it was Tamid Kitoras Menorah Pesach. So, both say that's important. Let's just end off. We know again. There's a lot more halacha, which hopefully we'll get into one of these days. But listen to this. So the Rambam in Hilchos Karban Pesach Perek Aleph Halacha Dalet writes as follows. The Rambam writes. He goes on. He says ve'in shochtin oso ela achar tamid shel bein arbaim. So number 1, we shech the Pesach after the Tamid. Okay, so that already we saw from the first Mishnah. Achar shemaktirin ketorah shel bein arbaim. Va'achar shemativin es haneros maschilin lishchot es hapsochim ad sof hayom. So we'll say, in fact, the way the Rambam understands it is as follows: that halacha l'maisa, we offer up the Tamid Shel Bein Arbaim, the afternoon Tamid. Then we go ahead and offer up the afternoon Kitores. Then the menorah is arranged. Mativin es haneros means the menorah is set up and arranged. Then the Karban Pesach is offered. And the Karban Pesach then is shechted for the rest of the day, because the menorah itself is not kindled until a little bit later in the afternoon. But Lemaisa, the menorah itself is arranged before the offering of the Karban Pesach. Okay, so at least now we have a little bit greater clarity on our timeline. There's a couple of other additional interesting cases in the Rambam, but we'll save them for a different time. Mishnah, Pesach Sheshachtu. So I'll say now now that we've established our timeline, we're going to get a little bit deeper into some of the halachos concerning Karban Pesach. So Pesach Sheshachtu Shalol Lishmo, V'kiba V'halach V'zark Shalol Lishmo. So I'll say here's the case. Let's say you shechted your Karban Pesach Shalol Lishmo. Now we'll say, now what does that mean? You shechted it not for the sake of Pesach. So what did you shecht it for? So Rashi says you shechted it l'shem shlamim. Remember, Karban Pesach is a shlamim. It is a shlamim offering. In that, I should say, it's in the shlamim family. In that, remember again, what's a karban shlamim? Karban shlamim is any karban where part of it is consumed by the owner, part of it is consumed by the Kohanim, and part of it is consumed on the Mizbeach. Hence the name Shlamim. It makes Shalom because everyone gets a piece. So in this case over here, you shechted your Karban Pesach Shalol Lishmo. Not for the sake of Pesach, but rather for the sake of Shlamim. Or V'kiba V'halach V'zark Dama Shal Lishmo, you went and you did Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika. Remember again, Kabbalah means the receiving of the blood, sacrificial blood. Holacha, the transport of the blood from where you are ultimately to the Mizbeach, and Zrika, the sprinkling of the blood. So the Gemara says, Shalol Lishmo, O Shalishmo, Vishalol Lishmo. Or, we'll define what this means in the Gemara. You offered up the Karban Pesach, Lishmo and Shalol Lishmo. Both for the sake of Karban Pesach and for the sake of Shlamim. So here you had dual kavana, Lishmo and Shalol Lishmo. Oh, Shalol Lishmo, Lishmo. Or you offered it up for the sake of shlamim and kar pesach. So we'll say what the Gemara is pointing out, what the Mishnah is pointing out over here is you had both kavanas in different orders, right? In case number one, you had in mind ultimately again shelo lishmo and shelo lishmo for the sake of pesach, for the sake of shlamim. In case number two, for the sake of shlamim, for the sake of pesach. Puzzle. In all of these cases, it's puzzle. Okay, Kate said l'shmo v'shel l'shmo. Both say, what's the example of l'shmo and shelo l'shmo? L'shem Pesach, l'shem shlamim. Shelo l'shmo v'l'shmo. What does it mean? Shelo l'shmo and l'shmo. L'shem shlamim l'shem Pesach. So we'll say it sounds like not sounds like it's just different order, right? Shelo l'shmo and l'shmo means I have in mind that it should be for shlamim and it should be for Pesach, and l'shmo v'shel l'shmo means I have in mind that it should be for Pesach and for shlamim. Okay, let's analyze. Says the Gemara, we'll say this is a great kasha. When we talk about the fact that now I have a carbon pesach and I'm offering it up, let's say lishmo and shelo lishmo, for the sake of pesach and for the sake of shlamim. When are those two kavanas occurring? Are they occurring in one avoda, one sacrificial process? Like for example, I will say, does it mean that when the Kohen is sprinkling the blood, during the act of sprinkling it, first he has kavanah for Pesach, then he has kavanah for Shlamim, or does it mean that he has two different kavanas in two different avodos? So let's say, for example, during Shechita, he has in mind for Pesach, and during Kabbalah, he has in mind for Shlamim. So what are we talking about? When we speak about two kavanas, is it two kavanas in one avoda, or two kavanas in two avodas? So the Gemara says, Tanan, so I'm sorry. So do we say that it's two kavanas in one avoda? Rabbi Yosihi, da'amar af bigmar devarav adam nitbas. So we'll say, let's talk about this in just a moment. There's a machlokes Rabbi Yosi and Rabbi Meir. If you take a look at Rashi, it is Rashi in Di'i Rabbi Meir, it's the last Rashi on the daf. The Mesachas Temura Gabea Omer Ze Temuras Ola Temura Shlamim. We'll say, listen to this. So very simply, we know that there's a concept of temura. Temura means that you're not allowed to swap out a sacrificial animal. So for example, if you designate your sheep as a shlamim, you can't change it to a chatos, right? You can't swap it out for another animal for a chatos. But we'll say, so let's say in this particular situation, let's say a person says, Hareze temuras ola temuras shlamim. I have a sheep, and let's say I'm going to go ahead and offer it up as an ola. But instead I say this animal should be an exchange for an ola or for a shlamim. I say two things. It should be a temuras ola, temuras shlamim. So what do I do with that? So interestingly enough, Rabbi Meir is of the opinion, tafas lashon rishon. Tafas lashon rishon means we look at the first thing you said, and everything after your first statement is inconsequential. So if you said ola, then ultimately it's a temuras ola. Rabbi Yossi holds tafos dvar or bigmar dvarav adam nitbas. Rabbi Yossi essentially says we look at everything you say. Literally, it means is we look at the last thing you said. But what it really means is we look at everything you said. We look at everything you said. Now, the exact ramifications of the Temura case are not really important for us right now, so let's focus on this. So the Gemara says, what's the case? Do we say, Ba'avoda achas tanan, is the case of Karan Pesach with two avodos, is the case of Karan Pesach with two kavanas happening in one avoda, and Rabbi Yossi the Amar af bigmar dvarav adam nitbas. And Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that when you say multiple things, all of them are halachically relevant and important. Therefore, in the course of one avoda, if you have in mind for Pesach and Shlamim, Rabbi Yossi says, I'm sorry, you've just puzzled your Karban Pesach because you have erroneous kavanah. The Gemara says, Di Rabbi Meir, ha'amar tafas lo shemishon. Because according to Rabbi Meir, we'll say, all we do is look at the first thing you said, and ultimately everything else is inconsequential. Top of Samach, Odilma, or the other possibility is, B'shtei avodos tanan. That perhaps the Mishnah, when it talks about multiple kavanas, is talking about multiple kavanas in two avodos. So for example, by Shechita you had in mind for Pesach, and by Zrika you had in mind for Shlamim. Va'afilu Rabbi Meir damar tafos lashon rishon. And even Rabbi Meir who says that normally all we do is look at the first thing you said, Hanimili ba'avoda achos, that's only true by one avoda. Aval b'shtei avodos modu demifsal. But even Rabbi Meir would hold that if you have two different kavanas in two different avodos, you will invalidate your carbon. You will invalidate the carbon. So we'll say, so this is actually a pretty profound machlokes. First of all, it's a generally profound machlokes. You know, Rabbi Rabbi Yossi, that when a person says multiple things, ultimately, again, what defines their kavanas? So Rabbi Meir says, Tafas Lashon Rishon. Tafas Lashon Rishon. Whatever the first thing that came out of your mouth, that's your kavana. Rabbi Yossi says, Tafas Afil Lashon Achar. No, everything that comes out of your mouth is consequential and gives us an insight into your kavana. So Shabbos say, if you think about it, also has a dramatic, hashkafic ramification about how do you look at people, right? So Rabbi Meir will say, Tafas Lashon Rishon. Right? You could tell a lot about a person by what comes out of their mouth first, right? Especially perhaps in stressful circumstances or under duress, kind of how does a person talk? What does a person say? Tafas Lashon Rishon, look at what comes out. Whereas Rabbi Yossi will say, no, people are complicated beings. And ultimately, again, have many different kavanas, and have many different hashkafas, and have many different reactions. And no person is defined by one utterance, by one statement, or by one event. But rather, again, we are made up of multiple different things, multiple different utterances, multiple different kavanas, and multiple different hashkafas. So I think it's a fascinating machlokes in human nature as well. Okay, so the goes back to Pesachim. So the shaila is, when we speak about having two different types of kavana and passing the carbon Pesach, is it two different types of kavana in one avoda, or two different types of kavana in two avodos? Amri ahiyas. So let's analyze this. Which case you're referring to? Imema ashalo lishmo v'lishmo. If you're talking about the case in the Mishnah of shalo lishmo and lishmo, where first you have kavana for shlamim and then for Pesach, bein avoda achas bein shtei avodos. Whether you're talking about that this is happening in one avoda or two avodos, bein the Rabbi Meir, bein the Rabbi Yossi, ifsil le l'kamaisa. So I will say, either way, the carbon should be invalidated. Why? Because once you begin with the wrong kavana, at the end of the day, the carbon is invalid. Daha l'Rabbi Yossi nami af bigmar devarav adam nitbas islay. So we'll say, because remember, according to Rabbi Yossi certainly holds that what you say first is consequential. He just holds that we also look at what you said last. So halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says, if you're talking about a case of shalo lishmo and lishmo, we'll say that case where you start out with the kavana l'shem shlamim, everyone will agree that the carbon is possible, right? And whether ultimately, again, you're beginning that, you're doing that in one avoda or two avodos is inconsequential. Once you begin the offering of a carbon Pesach for the sake of shlamim, we're done. We're done. Because I will say, I want to be clear, because it's a very important point. When the Gemara says that according to Rabbi Yossi, that we look at not just the first thing you said and also the last thing you said, it means we even look at the last thing you said. In other words, we don't just, but once you say the wrong thing first, then by definition, you've shut down the sacrificial process. So rather, again, it must be that our machlokes between one avodah or two avodas must be talking about the second case, which is shalo and shalo lishmo, where you begin the process l'shem karban pesach. You begin the process in the right way, but somewhere along the way your kavana switches to shlamim. Then our discussion is, okay, when is that happening? Is that happening in one avoda, or is that happening in two avodos? So what's the halacha? So Tashma, let's analyze. So first of all, it's very important, because now we're narrowing it down a little bit. The case of shalo lishmo and lishmo is a pretty quote-unquote easy case. Everyone is going to agree that what? The carbon is invalid, right? Because once you begin the sacrificial process with a kavana l'shem shlamim, then yes, it is going to be possible. The shaila is in l'shmo and shalo l'shmo. What's the halacha? So here we go. So tashma hapesach sheshachtu shalo l'shmo. If you shechta the carbon pesach shalo l'shmo for shlamim, v'kibel v'halach v'zark shalo l'shmo. And you did Kabbalah, Holach, Azrika, Shalo, Lishmo. So, Hechi Dami, what's the case? Inema Kediktani, if you want to say that it's literally just as written, so Lamali Ad Mechashev Lakulhu. We'll say, why do I need Shalom Lishmo by Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, and Zrika? After all, Mikamaise Ifsile. They both say, once you do the Shchita, L'Shem Shlamim and not L'Shem Pesach, the carbon by definition is possible. Elalav Hachi Katani. Rather, it must be that what the Gemara is saying is as follows. HaPesach sheshachtu Shalom Lishmo. If you shechted a carbon Pesach, Shalom Lishmo L'Shem Shlamim, Inami shachto Lishmo. V'kibel v'halach v'zarak Shalom Lishmo. Or even if you shechted it Lishmo, but you did either Kabbalah, Holacha, and Zrika, Shalom Lishmo, or Inami, Shachto, Vikibel, Vahalach Lishmo, or maybe you did Kabbalah, or excuse me, Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha Lishmo, Bizarak, Shalom Lishmo, but you did Zrika, Shalom Lishmo, Tahavile Shtei Avodos. Ultimately, you're going to both say, so what do you see from here? That Karm Pesach is possible. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, even if you begin the carbon l'shmo, but you do one of the major sacrificial processes, shelo l'shmo, that's what? That halacha l'maisa, the carbon is invalid. The carbon is invalid. And now this is showing you that even in shtei avodos, right? Even though this is happening where? This is happening in two different avodos over here, right? So here, I'm doing shchita l'shmo, but I'm doing either Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika, Shalom Lishmo. The carbon is invalid. Ema Seifa, yet look at the end of the Mishnah. Lishmo v'Shalom Lishmo. So remember again, what's the case of Lishmo and Shalom Lishmo? Hey, Ridami. Inema b'shtei avodos hainu reisha. See if you tell me that it's talking about two avodos, then the reisha and the Sefer are saying the same case. Elalav ba'avoda achas. Rather, it must be talking about a case of Lishmo and Shalom Lishmo in one avoda. And telling me that even Lishmo and Shalom Lishmo in one avoda passes the carbon. For Rabbi Yossi, he da'amar af bigmar dvarav adam nitpas. And ultimately, again, it must be Rabbi Yossi who holds that what? That a person is held accountable for all of his utterances. And therefore, technically speaking, we'll say, let's say just in the process of shchita, I begin the shchita l'shem Pesach, and then what happens? During the shchita, my kavanah switches ultimately to shlamim. Halacha l'maisa, the carbon becomes invalid, right? Invalid, even though it's one avoda. The Gemara says, "Lo, not necessarily the ola b'shtei avodos." It could very well be that we're still talking about two avodos. The reisha diktani b'shchita, the kamechashe b'shchita. The reisha is talking about a case, I will say, where I'm engaged in shchita, and my kavana is by shchita. Inami kai bezrika v'kamechashe bezrika. We'll say furthermore again, or I'm doing zrika, and I have in mind ultimately again for zrika. So we'll say, so the first part of the Mishnah is talking about a case where I'm engaged in one avoda, and I have one consistent kavana throughout that avoda. But again, what the Mishnah is teaching me is, even though I have the right kavana by shchita, if I have the wrong kavana by zrika, or by one of the other avodos, that will invalidate the carbon. Okay, that's case number one. So we'll say, so let's just kind of rack up our facts as we get them here. Even if you start out offering up the Karban Pesach with the right kavana, so you do shchita l'shem Pesach, but then you have the wrong kavana, i.e. for shlamim, by Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika, the carbon is invalid. Okay, fine. We'll say, but watch this. The Gemara says, Seifa, the second part of the Mishnah is going to teach you something different. This is incredible. The kai b'shchita, the kachoshev b'zrika. Wow. We'll say, listen to this case. In this case over here, what the Siddur is going to teach you is as follows. I'm doing shchita on the Karban Pesach. And by my shchita, what's my kavana? L'shem Pesach. But as I'm doing the shchita, I think to myself, you know what? When I do the zrika, I'm going to have in mind to do the zrika l'shem shlamim. You hear this? This is incredible. So here, I'm doing the shchita for the correct purpose, but I'm having the wrong kavana for a future avoda. So I'm doing the shchita l'shem Pesach, and I have in mind that the zrika is going to be l'shem shlamim. The kai b'shchita, the kachosha b'zrika, damer harini shochet es ha-Pesach l'shmo, lizrog damo shalo l'shmo. Well, as I said, literally, I have in mind that I'm shechting the carbon Pesach Lishmo, but I'm going to do the Zrika Shalom Lishmo. Don't ask why. Don't ask why, right? The why of this doesn't matter. Why somebody would have this kavana, right? That's inconsequential. Right? We've been learning Gemara for long enough to know you never ask the why. And I will say a case like this happening is probably very, very far-fetched. But Lamais, remember again, we're trying to go ahead and create principles. So whenever you want to create principles, it's actually helpful to use an exaggerated hyperbolic case, because that's how you go ahead and isolate the concepts. So here, literally, I'm doing the shechita, and I'm mamish tears coming down my eyes, l'shem mitzvahs Pesach. But I'm going to do the zrika l'shem shlamim. So what happens in that case? So the Gemara says, the kamash malon. But so here's the principle that comes out. And Abba said the principle, ultimately again, that is being highlighted over here is that you could have kavanah from one avoda to the next. So Abba said, so this is incredible. So what it's saying over here is that halacha l'maisa, you could have kavanah. I want to be clear. I'm engaged in the shechita, but during the shechita, and I'm doing the shechita correctly, Shem Pesach. But during the shechita, I have in mind to go ahead and do the zrika l'shem shlamim. What's the status of the carbon? Invalid. I've invalidated the carbon by having kavana during one avoda for another avoda. Now, again, let me be clear. The problem is not thinking about zrika during shechita. The problem is having kavana during shechita that I'm going to do zrika l'shem shlamim. So you see from here that kavana that is possessed by one avoda for another avoda could invalidate the carbon. Look at Rashi for just a moment. And this, by the way, apparently was a question that Rav Papa brought up. So Rashi says over here, the mechashen me'avoda le'avoda kilomar, the mechashev ba'avoda b'shas avoda zu al chaverta, lasos machshavas pasel, nifsal miyad. So listen how dramatic this is. So the Gemara says over here like this. The Gemara says, if during Shechita, so I'm doing Shechita Lishma, but during Shechita, I have in mind that I'm going to do Zurika Shalom Lishma. But Rabbi said, let's say by the time I go ahead and I get to Zurika, I decide, you know what, now I'm going to do Zurika L'Shem Pesach. The carbon is still invalid. Why? Because again, Rabbi say, since at the time of Shechita, I had in mind to do Zurika, not for the sake of carbon Pesach, that automatically invalidates the carbon. So we'll say, pretty dramatic idea. So remember again, the Gemara is going ahead and so far teaching me two principles. Principle one is that halacha l'maisa, if you do, let's say you do the shechita l'shma, zrika shalom l'shma, or kabbalah shalom l'shma, if you do one avoda l'shma, one avoda not l'shma, carbon is possible. That's aleph. Beis, right? Beis. If you're doing shechita l'shma, and during shechita you have in mind to do another avoda shalom l'shma, carbon is possible. Chiddush being, even if by the time you get to that subsequent avoda, you end up doing it l'shma, your kavanah to do it shalom l'shma invalidates the carbon. Tashma. Oh, shalom l'shmo v'lishmo apostle. Shall I say, remember again, second case was, you have in mind to do the carbon shalom l'shmo and lishmo. What's that case? What's the case of shalom l'shmo and lishmo? Heichi dami, inema b'shtei avodos. If you want to say he's talking about two avodos, hashta lishmo v'shalom l'shmo amrit pasol. So we'll say, that's obvious. If you already told me that lishmo and shalom lishmo is pasol, shalom lishmo v'lishmo v'boy. So you're right to hear the kasha. If you already told me that lishmo and shalom lishmo, where you're starting out lishmo, and then you change it to shalom lishmo, that's going to be pasol. Certainly a case of what? Shalom lishmo and lishmo is going to be pasol. Elalav ba'avoda achos. Rather, I must be talking about where you have these two different kavanas in one avoda. So we'll say, let's say by shechita, you begin the shechita l'shem shlamim shalom l'shmo, but then during the shechita you switch your kavana ultimately again to l'shmo. Umid the seifa bavo, and it's possible. Umid the seifa bavoda achos, and the fact that the seifa is talking about one avoda, reisha nami ba'avoda achos. The reisha must also be talking about one avoda as well. To which the Gemara says, "Lo, li'olam b'shtei avodos." Ultimately, again, the seifa is perhaps talking about two avodos as well. And really, Abba say you don't need the seifa, because Abba say it makes sense. Once you tell me that lishmo and shalom lishmo is puzzle by two avodos, then what Rabbi say? It goes without saying that what? Shalom lishmo and lishmo we puzzle by two avodos. Rabbi say, right? You hear the logic? Once you tell me if you start out the right way and then go and then do something wrong, the carbon is invalid. Certainly what? Certainly what? If you start off the wrong way, even if you pivot to doing things right, of course the carbon is going to be valid. To which the Gemara says, you're right. You actually don't need the seifa. You're right. And in reality, it's just supposed to say for textual symmetry. It's really only, since we wrote the first case, we'll write the second case. So since we wrote a case of Lishmo and Shalom Lishmo, we'll also write the case of Shalom Lishmo and Lishmo, even though the case of Shalom Lishmo is incredibly intuitive. So Tashma, Shacht, we'll say this is great. Shachto Shalom Li Ochlav Shalom Menuyav. We'll actually spend some more time on this. This is actually tomorrow's daf, we'll see. Tashma, Shachto Shalom Li Ochlav Shalom Menuyav. Supposed to, let's say you shechted the carbon Pesach for the sake of people who are not going to eat it. Shalom Li Ochlav. So, right, people who are not going to eat it, or people really Rashi points out who can't eat it. Let's say for a chola or a zakin, someone who's very old, someone who's very ill. So you had them in mind during the time of the shechita, but of course they cannot partake of the carbon pesach. Or shalom lemenuyav, or for people not registered for your chabura. Both said we will discuss that in order to partake of carbon pesach, you must be registered, quote unquote, as part of a group before the carbon was shechted. Or la'arelim, uncircumcised individuals. Litmein, people who are tamei. So I'll say the point over here is you're shechting your carbon pesach for the sake of people who cannot partake of the carbon. What's the halacha? Puzzle. The carbon is invalid. So the Gemara says, Hacha pshita ba'avoda achos. This is obvious that it's talking about again one avoda. One avoda, right? Because I will say, remember again, in this case, it's one machshava. Right, you're having one machshava, so obviously, again, you're just having a machshava to shecht it for people who can't eat it. So you're having one machshava, one avoda. Now the Gemara says, "Umi the seifa ba'avoda achas, reishnami ba'avoda achas." And since the seifa, the second part of the Mishnah, because we view these Mishnayos as one unit, since that Mishnah is talking about avoda achas, it must be that our Mishnah is talking about avoda achas as well. To which the Gemara says, "No. Me the area hakadisa v'hakadisa seifa ba'avoda achas." Reisha ibavoda achas ibshte avoda. It's not necessarily just because the latter Mishnah is talking about one avoda. Our Mishnah could be set up as talking about one avoda or two avodos as well. Tashma liochlav v'shalo liochlav kasher. Both say, listen to this interesting case. Let's say when you shecht your carbon pesach, you shecht it liochlav and shal liochlav. You have in mind to shecht it for people who can eat from it and from people who can't eat from it. So you have both of these kavanas when you go ahead and you shed your carbon pesach. What's the halacha? Kosher. The pesach is kosher. Okay, what's the case? Hechidami inema b'shtei avodos. If you want to say he's talking about two avodos, v'time b'dechashiv bizrika, de'in machshavas ochlin bizrika. And also maybe the case over here is where you had this erroneous mindset during zrika. But also now an interesting fact that we will see is that halacha l'maisa, if you have a machshavas psul, an invalid mindset regarding consumption by zrika, that does not go ahead and invalidate the carbon. It's what's called in machshavas ochlin bizrika. An invalid mindset regarding consumption does not invalidate by zrika. Haba avoda achas kigon b'shchita. Mahangili machshavas ochlin pasal. But yet again, by different avoda, like shchita, where ultimately again an erroneous mindset regarding consumption can invalidate the carbon. The carbon will be pasal. I v'ha kamalon mixas ochlin lo pasla. But I will say we've learned elsewhere that if you will say, so let's say if imagine the following situation, you have in mind that you have 10 people in mind who are going to eat from your carbon pesach, but let's say for argument's sake only 6 of them are permitted to go ahead and eat from the carbon pesach. We learned elsewhere, we'll see actually where we learned this, that what we call mixas ochlin lo pasla, having in mind for some additional group who can't eat from the Pesach to partake of the Pesach does not invalidate the Pesach as long as what? As long as you have kavanah for the right group. Okay, so the Gemara says, Ella amadeis, Ella lav ba'avoda achas. Rather, it must be talking about where the invalid mindset is for one avoda. Umi the seifa ba'avoda achas, from this fact that the seifa is talking about one avoda. Reisha nami ba'avodacha. So we'll say, so remember again, we view these mishnayos all as kind of flowing from the same place. So from the fact that halacha l'maisa, the latter mishnah is by avoda achos, and we'll say that our mishnah is by avoda achos as well. To which the Gemara says, no, midi irya halki di isa v'halki di isa. Two different mishnayos or two different cases. Seifa ba'avoda achos. V'reisha o ba'avoda achos o b'shtei avodos. It's very possible that the latter mishnah is talking about one avoda, but our mishnah could be framed as having an invalid mindset either by one avoda or by multiple avodos. Okay, we'll say here we go. Another question. So we'll say so. Just to be clear, remember, just to maintain focus, our Mishnah introduces us to the concept that halacha l'maaseh, if you have dual kavana, right? Remember again, what's your dual kavana? For the sake of Pesach and for the sake of Shlamim, your karban is invalid. And what we're trying to frame, and we'll see the halacha l'maaseh, we're trying to frame, is that talking about multiple kavanas in one avoda or multiple kavanas in different avodos? So remember again, the way the Gemara kind of left off is that we're talking about multiple kavanas in multiple avodos. Because remember, when you get to multiple kavanas in one avoda, that's when we enter into the machlokes Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Meir. That whenever you say two statements that are contradictory, how do we view that? Right? Rabbi Meir telling us tafas lashon rishon. Just look at the first thing the person said, and anything else is inconsequential. Whereas Rabbi Yossi says, no, you have to pay attention to all of the statements. So we're trying to figure out, therefore, what the Mishnah is referring to. Ibaylo, both say another interesting case. Pesach sheshachtu b'shar yemos hashana lishmo v'shalosh. Also, listen to this case, a totally different case. Let's say you shech the carbon Pesach. There's only one issue, which is it's not Pesach. It's not Pesach. So I will say, so you shecht a carbon Pesach in Shvat. And when you shecht it, you have in mind that it should be the Shmo v'shelo the Shmo. So I will say, so now understand what's happening over here. So in this case, the Shmo means for Pesach, Shelo the Shmo means for Shlamim. So I will say, so look at Rashi just a little bit. Pesach b'shai mos hashana, it's almost right across. Keep going. Shefrisho kodem lachin yamim rabim. You set aside your Karban Pesach in Chodesh Shvat. V'kaim alon v'kasher l'shlamim. Now I will say that's not a problem because even an animal designated as a Pesach during the rest of the year can be offered up as a shlamim. So the Gemara says, "Bepirkin l'kamon v'imshachtu lePesach pasol delavz manehu v'lishem shlamim shachtu kasher." So let's listen to this. So remember, if you let's say again, I'm being Maber Sedra, and I see in this week's Parashas Bo, the Torah says that you have to go ahead and take your Karban Pesach on the 10th of Nisan. I always like to be Machmir, so I'm going to take my Karban Pesach on the 10th of Shvat. So I take my Karban Pesach on the 10th of Shvat, and then I slaughter it. And when I slaughter it, I go ahead and I shecht it, l'shem Pesach and l'shem Shlamim, for both. So what's the status of the carbon say? So mahu mi asi shelo l'shmo mafikle midei l'shmo umachshile. So do we say in this case the shelo l'shmo could go ahead and trump the l'shmo, right? Could go ahead and overrun the l'shmo, and therefore again effectively